could be successful, but maybe it's not the success that I want to find.
Our guest today is a good friend, an avid fly fisher, and brilliant product designer. He is the solo founder of Ripplebox, a company to develop and produce a fly fishing product of his own design. He has worked on products in the medical industry, pure industrial design, startup technology, and art fabrication. He has started ventures in scrap metal and consumer products. It is our pleasure to talk with Joshua Richards today.
Going right back to the start, it was growing up in Shropshire, small town called Coalbrookdale. My parents were academics. A lot of my friends' parents were either academics or admin, so there was very much a culture or a note to growing up that work was just what people did between weekends. And I don't think, thinking back, I knew anyone who had a company or aspirations to run a company. So it was sort of expected that you'd end up working for someone. And then I think I struggled at school. I've never been diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure I'm dyslexic the way I deal with numbers. So design was the first time I ever got like really positive feedback from a teacher. It was often before that I was sort of distracted or flitty or not really engaged. But in design, I was described as sort of creative and able to bring a different perspective, and that was a lovely feeling. So I think that sort of tied me into a path of design quite early. And then I had a really good technical college I went to, and the teachers there were enthusiastic about product design. He'd done a furniture design course, and it had a really well tooled up workshop, and it sort of gave me a love of making, and they had a lot of autonomy. We could just sort of get in and use the tools. They had sort of welding and metal fabrication and some early sort of CNC stuff and a lot of hand tools and shape. So there was a good grounding in that, and that sort of set me on a path and went through to Coventry University to study industrial product design. I think it's the same experience for many people who've done a design course at uni. It's you start to get sort of an introduction maybe to what the tools are and how to use them in sort of design, but also becoming more competitive and starting to practice those ideas of pitching and having influence in a group, and starting to understand how you can communicate about design. But still at that level, it was very much like, oh, I'd love to work for IDEO or Conrad. Like it wasn't an idea about enterprise or how design could become a business. I think if you think of it as a triangle, I think you come out of university sort of thinking that design is most of the triangle, then that the business is the bit at the bottom, and it's almost this echo chamber that if you have a great idea, like people will recognize it and notice it, and the art of having the idea was the big picture of design. And from my experiences, not true. So a difficult point to frame an idea of thinking to have. And then as part of my university course, I got to go to Melbourne for a year to do an industrial placement. And that was the first time you sort of have that view really challenged, in the idea that actually you don't know everything, and just working for someone maybe isn't enough. And I worked for it was a really small company called Mari's Production Services, and they did a lot of sort of fees, cash for services, sort of engineering support or FEA analysis, or all these different bits. But they also sold a number of small products, and it was the first time I'd ever really seen like a passive income stream that wasn't someone who had a second house to rent or they'd invested in something ages ago. But the idea of you could actually do something that you'd then reap the rewards for later. And it felt a long way away, but it was also that first sort of earworm that actually that's a really interesting way of working.
Were there experiences maybe, at Mari's Production Services, or maybe even earlier than that you feel like really had like a strong influence on you, that took you from, getting credit for that design project to really making that a passion in your life?
Yeah, the first one that jumps was we'd gone. It was secondary school, like the first day of secondary school. So we'd been. I don't even know how old, but it was like a badge making class, and the teacher had said that you can make a badge for every idea. Like if you gave you a sheet of circles, and every one that was unique, you could make a badge for. And like I remember other people sitting down and maybe drawing out 3 or 4, and then scratching their heads, and I was just reeling off sheets of them, just one after the other. Just
Ha 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 ha.
it was the first time that I was like, and it was. I remember looking around and other people. It was like, oh, maybe it was the first time I thought that maybe my head works a little bit differently, or I'm able to see things differently. And that was the first time I think that the group I hung around with at school were all very academic and very talented in sort of the site, like the classical education stuff. So I was sort of pulled along in their wake, but very much not the smart one. And that was the first time that I'd really excelled in like a school environment, and that made me super passionate, I suppose, that actually this is something that I could lean into.
Thank you so much, Josh. I really, obviously, as someone you work with, I've seen you, actually in the office and all of the sort of focus you put on the human-centered approach to your work. And clearly you've just given us, and I've, again, seen a million times, the way that you can come up with curious and interesting and different and great ideas. This might seem like a convoluted question, but how do you both come up with ideas that inspire you whilst keeping the user in mind? Because I feel like those are in some ways combative against each other.
One of the things my wife says I do is I become hyperfixated. So I'll recently it's been spearfishing, and I'll just go on a super wormhole into who are the heroes and the villains, and what's the technology and how's it progressed, and I'll understand the intricacies and the mechanisms and the material processes and how things are made. And that's often happening on a sideline. And then when I get a project that comes up, it's suddenly got this wealth of interest in. And often though, like the challenges for one area or one niche is similar to another, but it's you've just got this. Actually, if I could take a mechanism from this that's been known and developed for hundreds of years and employ it over here. And I think that's having lots of these interest areas, lots of hobbies, and lots of things that I read up on and try and understand. I have this wealth of, I suppose, idea seeds that I can then plant into a project. In terms of trying to find user in it, I guess it's empathy. I don't think of myself as a particularly talented engineer at the moment. I'm working in more of an engineering role. I just try and think of how I'd want to use it, and if I was in somebody else's shoes, I suppose it's just about trying to stop and question, like, is this useful? I don't know if that's an answer to the question. Sorry, Spencer, that was a ramble.
I think that was a great answer. There's definitely not a wrong answer to any of these questions, so please know that. And I like that, you're always trying to think like the user in the back of your mind. I guess this is probably my inexperience in the industry, but do you get to have any sort of direct contact with test groups at any point? Or is that something you've experienced in another role? And do you find that that's helpful, or is that just kind of a little bit much?
I think it's often that people know the solution, and the designer is just trying to get the right people in the room to have that idea. A lot of my work, so one of the places I worked was PDD, and that was the first time. It's a consultancy, Pankhurst Design Development, based in Hammersmith in London, and they're connected to the Luma Institute, and it's all about human-centered. And that was the first time I'd sort of heard the expression and sort of, I suppose, was introduced to the craft of it. And a big part of that is going out and having a group of users to first maybe just go and understand. It's to say we're going to look at music, and we want to do a new project about music, and it's about, okay, what are people passionate about? Like, what are the opportunities that they're missing currently? Like, what are the things that get them really, like, what's the thing that if you could just you could have one feature, if of their current audio system, if you could strip everything back, what's the one thing that they'd hang on to? I don't think you get that from just engineering something new. You have to go and talk to people and understand what the passion is. I think if you can pin that down, then it becomes really easy to go away and try and bring a new innovation to a market. Yeah, so I think talking to people's really important. The other thing that I've done a lot of is the co-collaboration. So once you've spoken to people and maybe you've given them a bunch of existing products and they can test it and they can sort of log it and build an experience with it, and then you talk to them about that, and it's actually bringing them back in once you've got your first round of concepts and saying like, this is what I've interpreted as your pain points and this is what I've interpreted as a possible solution. I did a lovely project at PDD on a mop, and we were talking about it was a lot of parents who had done the study. They were talking about how actually they didn't use mops very often. They'd use them once a week in like the deep clean of the house. They weren't using them to react to spills. They'd use baby wipes or a tea towel, just because it was something you could grab, and it'd just be a packet. You could have lots of these packets everywhere and just grab what you needed. We sort of went away and we made this mop that was tiny with this like telescoping like fold out handle. And again, it was at the time my obsession was sort of ultralight camping gear. It's a mechanism we'd appropriated from some walking poles. We had this mop to represent to them, and you'd flung it out and it just popped up almost like magic to respond to a spill, and people just hated it. It was, well, it sort of fit the brief to how what their behaviour we'd observed and seen, and it felt to them it was too flimsy, or it was something that would break or something. It was just it didn't match the user's interpretation of their need. Actually working backwards from that, but the idea of transformable mop was really, really interesting to them, but it was a real barrier, the number of sections that were involved in this pole. We ended up making it so it just folded in half, and that was enough. Like it was the sweet spot. Like what people wanted was a mop was too big to store, so that you didn't use it to react. Just folding in half was like a sensitive enough to capture the fact that maybe I can store it one of these 5 places now rather than before I had to store it here. And I think that's the beauty of talking to users is trying to find that what's the ultimate value and what's the right way to deliver that. It's understanding where the threshold is. Often sort of use case does this. If you don't get all the way over that next level, it's sort of not much better than being a bit further back. And in that case, just folding in half was just at the start of that next level of value to people.
Absolutely. And I think getting that input from people early on, it can be so valuable. You can really see sort of the pit holes coming in front of you, or, maybe a diamond in the rough that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, when people say, actually, I really like this thing or really hate that thing. So I really appreciate you going into that in depth for us. Now, obviously, you've gone on to Ripplebox on the side. How did you really take that from something that you were just really interested in into a business? And were there particular inspiration points that you had?
If I can, I suppose, if you jump back into the history a bit more, there's a few lessons I learned along the way that sort of allowed that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so after I finished uni, I left thinking I knew enough and I didn't want to work in London. It was something I didn't have any reason why, but my parents didn't like London much, so I sort of never came down here and just thought it was something I want to avoid. So I ended up starting a company at home called 636C Design. It was like a tedious Pantone sky blue, which I thought was really clever at the time. And I got some really nice projects. We did some museum exhibits for a local place, and it was motors spinning and interactions and cages, and we designed a full retrofit of a shop and some sort of merchandise for places. I just didn't pay myself anything, and just sort of completely anything that I earn I just spent. And like the first lessons were, okay, if I'm going to run a company, I need to be able to be myself. and I did a company that was called Focus on Fishing. It was an educational company. And this time it was set up with a couple of people, and we were getting a few grants. We were going into schools and teaching STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and maths. We were running on these educational grants, which was quite interesting at the time. But it wasn't something I was super passionate about. I'd started a business that I didn't really want to do the day to day on, so I that became a lesson as well. That actually, okay, I need to pay myself, but I also need to be interested enough in doing it. Then, various ways, I found myself at PDD contracting. As I said at uni, there was never any idea about what the business of design was. So, freelancing, I remember, was a whole new idea to me. So I got this role freelancing, and it was they were just week-long contracts, and I did them for 6 months. So every Friday, I'd take all of my bags into the office, and they'd tell me if they needed me on Monday or not, and it sort of gave me this really suppose like high risk way of living. I just got super comfortable without having very much or without knowing very much, and being able to just keep on. People I met at PDD were brilliant. It was the first time I'd felt like actually I'm a small fish in quite a big pond, and
No pun intended.
yeah. That's it. I managed to become this, just really focus on core skills and really focusing on actually I could get good at design. It was sometime actually there's all this like PDD had a fantastic model shop, and I didn't know enough about that, and I wanted to be a brilliant model maker. Then they had like really good engineers, and I wanted to know enough about that. And then they had like a really good pitching their ideas onto clients and selling in schemes of work. And actually I was getting more and more skilled up with this, but understanding where that was going hadn't really formulated itself. But I met a chap there called Graham Davis, who was he was doing licensing for a company called Joseph, who makes sort of like the poppy coloured kitchenware. And he used to work 4 days a week and do licensing 1 day a week. It was like this like light bulb moment. Like I'd seen that's what Ari's production services were doing, and he ended up giving me an opportunity to work with him. He had a kid and he didn't have enough time to commit to it, so I did a lot of the grunt work, the actual design and the CAD, and we'd come up with ideas together, and we'd sort of license those off to Joseph. That gave me 1 day a week. It funded me off, so I was then doing a 4-day contract and 1 day a week for myself, generate these ideas. I think going back to your point, Spencer, that was your question. That's what allowed me to get into Ripplebox. It was about chasing interests, but by making time and sort of investing that 1 day a week into stuff I was interested in, I was able to explore different ideas, and one of them was Ripplebox. And so Ripplebox is I'm into fly fishing, and you have these like little, they're almost like jewelry. It's like a hook. It's whipped with thread and fur and made to imitate a insect or a sort of an invertebrate that lives in the water that would become like a large part of the trout's diet. And there's a heritage and history that goes back to the Victorians of a lovely story about the feather thief, of some guy who broke into Tring Museum. There's a whole black market for antique feathers, so you can tie the perfect sort of salmon fly. But mine was much more sort of pragmatic than that. But these flies, they're quite hard to manage, and the boxes are fiddly, and your hands can be sort of wet and cold. And because I was working quite a lot, I wasn't getting to fish a lot. All my problems were coming from this one piece of equipment, and I just thought, actually, this is something I could design out. I've seen how PDD approach identifying an opportunity, and this looks like one, and I know the audience of which to talk to. I'm plugged into that, so I could have these conversations, and I've got this time I've put aside to actually start to think in this area. One of the other things I was noticing was, because I was always contracting, as the people who I'd maybe be working with at PDD who are my age were getting these other access to skills. They were doing project management and more budgeting. I was very aware that if I didn't have a route to do that as well, I'd be lagging behind. So I ended up employing a friend to do some freelance design, and I wanted to practice my brief writing, sort of budgeting, and then sort of managing somebody else doing the design work that I was interested in. And I got a friend, James, to do it. And he went away and he came up with this silicon ripple idea in which to hold the flies, and it was like this, like, whoa, I probably wouldn't have thought of that. Like that was so far beyond was interesting, but the technical challenges of how to go from a prototype that worked really well to a scalable industry, like how could we make this, was really challenging. And James was a furniture designer, still is. So he that wasn't a skill that I could continue to get him to do. So I jumped on it. I did a lot of the technical design myself in this sort of allotted free time I'd made. The challenges was Spencer was scaling. It was understanding. I didn't have a background to be able to understand how can I access sort of market forecasting or yeah.
Sure, but it sounds like you really took the knowledge that you did have. Like, honestly, this is like, to me, like I don't know, maybe it's the way you tell it now, but it sounds like the perfect entrepreneurial story. Like, I saw a problem in my life that no one else was tackling. Oh, I just made another pun, I'm sorry. But, and like you're like, "There's gotta be a way. I know some great people," and just bring them in as you needed them. That's really, really great. Yeah, but go ahead. I wasn't trying to interrupt your story, but I really appreciate where this is going.
Oh no, it's I appreciate it. So it was really interesting. We had this product, and because of the time I'd spent at PDD, and I knew how to prototype things, and I'd spent time in their model shop, and I'd learned about sort of silicon soft tooling and vacuum casting. I was able to make these really high resolution models. So they were cast silicon ripple things and compressed into these soft tooled boxes, and we made about, I think we made 15 of them, and we sent them out to the all of the like the top Instagram anglers and the people who were sponsored by the big names and people who owned like big estates for fly fishing and sort of like these real heritage people. And we sort of said, look, we think this is really interesting. Like, is this something you like? And we had this sort of overwhelming sort of positive response that actually this is a great idea. And also it was, people liked it, but there wasn't a lot of sense that people were looking for a better solution. I think at the time we saw that as something actually that would just work itself out. But I think that is one of the big challenges we're finding, is that there isn't a lot of innovation in the fly fishing market, which I thought meant that it's ripe for going in and providing all this innovation. Equally, there's not a lot of people maybe looking for innovation, so the lift on how much marketing we have to do to make these products visible is really difficult, and that's not a skill I have. So that's been a real challenge. And also like cost, like people want obviously great value, and our boxes are, I wanted to design it with my own ethics. A lot of the work I'd done professionally, you're having to save a penny here to, so actually the material selection isn't so good, or the we want to get the tooling cost for under this, so we'll make it abroad. And I knew that I wanted it to be 100% recyclable. I knew I wanted it to be made out of as many recycled materials as possible. I wanted to not use any material fillers that would make recycling harder. There's a latch on there that needs to be quite stiff, and rather than just putting glass fill into the nylon, we've made the wall thickness heavier, so we get that stiffness, but it's still a pure grade material. Didn't want to use any adhesives and how it's stuck together, which has made the assembly a real challenge. And when the only lever we could really pull to try and get cost out of it was to use cheaper manufacturing processes. We ended up using extrusion to make the silicon. At the time, it felt like a really great trade. We were going from a part that was costing, I think it was about £1.70, down to about 72. Like, we were saving £1 per box. I didn't have the experience to know or think of at the time, I suppose, because I was prototyping them. I could make every one perfect. I'd fettle and tweak. I know Spencer, I talk a lot at work about how my real skill in life is scratching stuff with a scalpel. These first 20 I'd made them as a model maker. I hadn't stepped back and thought, actually, it can't be me fettling each one a mass scale. So when it came to put the silicon into the box, we've had real trouble. Actually, then it became this whole, a lot of my time, which was going to be reserved for marketing and trying to sell these things, I've had to develop a whole raft of assembly tools and techniques and to get this silicon in the box, and now got a bunch of jigs with vacuum clamps and levers and arbor presses, and it's become this whole sort of convoluted thing where I've made myself this real bottleneck. I've made it so specialized that actually I'm the only person who can make this box. I think that's been a real challenge of Ripplebox in terms of launching a business and leaning into the bit that I thought I was very good at. Is that you can suddenly make a company where if you're not part of the process, it doesn't work, and then suddenly you can't scale anything because you've got to be the person who's bringing that special sauce, as in Shark Ninja language, to every single project.
And that is the entrepreneur's dilemma too, right? You're wearing all these different hats. I kind of want to ask you, do you feel like this is the most difficult juncture in this startup so far? Or in your opinion, is there another part you think was more difficult, kind of looking back?
So this has been very difficult, and I found good solutions for this. So so I sort of lent into what I knew. So the business wasn't growing because I wasn't able to make the boxes fast enough. We people come to us and they wanted like 2,000 units, and I just knew that means that's me in the shed for 2 weeks. I just couldn't do it. Now what I could do, I knew if I needed to get some revenue to be able to pay additional services, to be able to find someone to do the marketing and find someone to do the fulfillment. I approached another company in the same space who I knew was interested to try and take Ripplebox as a wholesale product, but the margins didn't quite work, and say actually I could design you a whole new range of boxes. Had a challenge where they were buying a sort of an OEM plastic box, branding it. There was somebody else who had an exclusivity to sell that same box in the States, and for fishing that's the big market. So seeing that again, like the classic, there's a problem, identify it, I can make you one of those. And it also tied into the wave of we were seeing difficulty in fulfillment from China into these markets. Like you're making these boxes, you're shipping a lot of air. So I was able to go to them and say, look, you've got a product that you can't sell in this market, and you're spending a huge amount to ship it from there to here and back again. But why not make your own range of things from a supplier you've got control of in the UK? And they went for it, and that's again, it was a license agreement. So leveraging the skills that I'd learned at PDD and had done with Joseph and Joseph, sort of bringing that in, and that's given the company a bit of space to breathe. It's taking time away from the main focus, which should be the development of Ripplebox. It's now earning enough to sort of keep itself ticking over. So that's been it's been tough, but it's also now I've got this platform where actually they're sort of self-sustaining, and we can start to think about, okay, which skills do we need to bring in to grow it? So although the technical side of it's been challenging, it's all been quite fun problems to solve. But early on in the sort of the Ripplebox story, James, who had designed the initial idea of this silicon ripple to hold flies, said that we'd sort of maybe we'll do this as a project together, and we were going to be co-founders in it. I think the thing that was really challenging was we tried to do a Kickstarter together, and we priced it for sort of expensive, like 100,000 shot steel tooling. It meant that the tooling cost was really high. Actually, we could have done aluminium tooling and just accepted that the margins were worse, which with hindsight is exactly what we should have done. But we were so focused on getting the best deal almost that we inflated the costs, and ended up the Kickstarter was unsuccessful. Then we had offer of private investment, and relationship between myself and James just wasn't very conducive in terms of what we both thought was the best path forward for the business, and that was really challenging because we'd started off as friends, and I felt like I had a right to make the choices because, or I'd put in a lot of the cash for the development, and uh, it was my company who owned the IP because I'd paid James as a freelancer for it. But James felt very invested because he'd had the idea initially. It was this real tension between who was pulling the reins and what was the best route for bringing this to market. And I think anyone who's a solo founder, it's really difficult. You're sort of out in the wilds by yourself. But if you're founding with someone that maybe you've started in a really, you felt like you're on the same page, but then realize you're not. It was really difficult to try and dissect what success looked like for both of us and the company at the time. And
Absolutely. Josh, I think that thank you so much for sharing that with us. I know that can be a difficult time. And as I think we've talked about a couple of times before, like the relationships within a company are within the founders is so important. And sometimes, like I've heard people say, you should you should treat it kind of like a marriage. Like that's how real it is in that sense. And I think that's such an important topic that people don't talk about enough. But one thing I do want to get into a little bit, because I know you have Clio, you have Ripplebox, you have a number of other things on the horizon, both family and business. How do you balance your work, your family life, and the things you're passionate about, like your own personal time?
yeah, it's a good question. I think at the moment it's it's been a struggle, and I think it's a really good question. How do I balance everything? I think you've got to work out. You're often firefighting, which is never a great way to go. You're trying to sort of do the most important parts for all of it, and I'm now trying to make more stuff. That's my new goal is stuff don't I have to do. I've got a lot more help in the admin of running in the accounts and things. I've paid more to have more hands off on that, and my wife is now involved doing that, and I've got friends who do a lot of social media stuff, and I'll push stuff over to them. I think with family, it's trying to take go out and get excited about making stuff. I suppose that's been some of it. Is trying to a lot of the ideas and small bits and the thinking can sort of be done at quite a low level. So if I needed to make a model, it was something for a project recently where it was mechanism I was working on. I knew I could sort of work it out in sort of popsicle sticks and pins, and I just set up the kitchen table covered with stuff. And while I was making it, Cleo was making it her own sort of mess. I think there's I think that will be my new coping strategy is to try and I'm trying to bring the family into it a bit more maybe. I don't know if that's a good option or not yet, but I'll learn. But the big one, Spence, is just investing in yourself in time. So I still work 4 days a week. Is my main sort of bread and butter, pay the mortgage role, and accepting that 20% hit on earnings gives me 1 day a week to try and be super productive. I think because I'm very aware of what that 1 day is costing me. I'm able to try and really treat it like when I wake up, I'm on it, and I can make a list of what I need to do and those things, what are the most important, and what can I push to, what can I do from a train while I'm commuting, can I do of an evening when I'm doing this, and trying to work out all the things I've got to do, like what have I got to do the 1 day I can be productive, and can I, yeah. The other thing is saying no, I suppose, which I'm not very good at. I think it would be yeah. So
Many of us are not, unfortunately. It's hard to find balance, and I think especially as someone running your own company, and I'm honestly curious, and you can answer this however you want to. I know on LinkedIn it says, you're taking a break. And I think a lot of us have trouble trying to find that point. Where is it safe or acceptable for me to, leave this 9 to 5 LinkedIn job and go work on, this other thing that I'm truly passionate about? And you have a family, like you said, you have a mortgage. How did you make that choice? And also, I feel like the way you messaged it on LinkedIn, you could just jump back in and have an explanation about, some big life event you were going through too. So how did you decide how you were going to do that?
Yeah, so I need to update that. I have jumped back in. So I took the first 3 months of this year off. Some of it was, I suppose, mental health. It was feeling like I was juggling too much. There was stuff that one day a week you can get quite good at keeping something ticking over, but it's very hard to build something. And Ripplebox needed to go from this point of where I was a bottleneck to we've redesigned the silicon, put some costs back in, but it will enable the higher quality production of the silicon part. So now the assembly, it'll be much cheaper and quicker, so we can outsource that. And by doing that, we then need to change the box that it fits in, and then there's an opportunity to change the packaging. I could see all of that, and I knew that it was more than I could do today. Week to week, I needed to just have a focused sprint on it. I think I spent 10 years freelancing. This idea of like a stable job it hasn't been something that I'm intimidated to lose. I suppose I feel like I could still step back and be a day-to-day practitioner if I needed to be. And when I was contracting, I got quite good at have a number in my head of what I wanted to earn that year. And when I got there, I'd sort of quit for that year. I suppose I'd often take off 2 or 3 months every year to focus on private projects or a woodworking thing I want to do, or something else I wanted to learn, or something else I wanted to make. So it's always been sort of a part of my process. Take that time. I think that for people, it seems I hear a lot of people say like, "Oh, you've taken 3 months. Like, I wish I could do that." I think I've just been lucky in the sense that I got into a habit of doing it early, maybe. So although I do it now, it feels like something I know how valuable it can be. Maybe that's a good answer.
Absolutely. And I think that what you said about freelancing and being comfortable with sort of not having that certainty, I think is almost a superpower as a founder, right? Like it makes you able to take risks and able to sort of push yourself into extreme scenarios. Like I know I don't work, I work a lot, but I know I don't work nearly as much as I did when I worked at my previous company, Biocarbon Engineering. And I know if I need to, I can put the pedal to the metal and do that, right? And I think that sort of understanding of yourself as well as willingness to um, be comfortable with risk is so powerful. And I wanted to get from you, in your personal opinion, are there other characteristics that you think are very powerful for a founder to have, especially in the solopreneur scenario that you're in?
I think you've got to be genuinely interested in what you're doing. Maybe like I know some people who are. It's maybe the financial reward at the end of it that's the interest. The idea that I could run a company that earns this. I'm very, very excited about the ideas. Like I thought of having an idea that maybe nobody's had before is what I find very compelling, and I think that's the bit is never going to get old and never going to get tired. And actually, I will keep. If I do trip and stumble or fail or meet a problem, I've got something that's not maybe related to the success of the company. I'm still going to be very passionate about, and maybe that's really important. Actually, even if everything goes badly, I'm still super enthusiastic about it. I think there's some power in just being along for the ride, almost, in a way.
I think that makes a lot of sense. There's another question I kind of wanted to ask you because you had expressed, well, I think kind of in your words, your interest in better understanding how sustainability, technology, and consumerism can find the perfect balance. And that sounds lovely to me. Um, so I was kind of wondering if you could use your talents, your abilities, and kind of this passion you have to find this balance to solve a problem that you have not had a chance to focus your energy on. Is there something you would want to tackle? And that's another good fishing pun. I do like that we've got a lot of them today. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to get into it. There's lots, but um, I think one of the things I've always struggled with is the idea of, as a designer, you're making things like every day you're trying to produce something new, and prototyping isn't very. I make a lot of waste that's it's just going to end up in landfill, and it might be resin casting or 3D printing supports or sort of the odd bits of this, like products I've hacked up. This idea of just always wanting to produce something new, I think there's something in me that's don't find it very satisfying, and I often thought that maybe the solution is to try and like design heirlooms. What could I do that people buy once and have forever? And Ripplebox has very much been developed on that sense. Like it's almost bomb proof, and in terms of fishing, I think it's the best thing. Like will last forever in fused normally, and I think that's one way, but that's not really a solve. You're still producing stuff, but maybe just less of it. The thing that gets me really excited, I'd like to work on, is the challenges in the thought process and the amount of energy you have to invest in a new product. As an engineer, I suppose, and a designer, like what if I could take those skills, apply it to a whole new industry? And the one I'd like to do would be conservation. I see that conservation. I've got a friend who's a wildlife ranger, and I'll say that, oh, we've got this problem, and I could buy this product and it would solve part of it, and I could buy this product and it would solve part of it, but they don't work together, and there isn't a design solution to them where they can say, well, I'll take this of A and this of B and we'll build C. Actually being able to do what I think could be real ecological of growth or progress, or something I could be super proud of, that I could solve with a product or a service that I designed. That would be my that could be a pinnacle. That could be something I'd like to do.
That's a great answer, Josh. Thank you. I know we've previously talked a bit about conservation and things like that, that you're interested in, and where potentially that could go in the past. But what I would like to get an understanding of now, you're at this point, you've got your success with Ripplebox, but you can see the paths forward with it. Obviously, you're working in Shark Ninja and impressing everyone as you do. Um, what do you see the next 5 years being like for you, like for your path forward?
Yeah, I think I think there's a pivot coming. I feel that your question you asked earlier, you sort of cut to the root of it. It's like, how do you juggle everything? And I think honestly, it's like it's only just is probably the answer I should have given. Actually, finding something to be really committed to is something I want in the next 5 years. As to what would be a big enough idea or opportunity that actually I could step away from the other side things, something that I could would pay the mortgage and the thing, but does let me have the autonomy and drive to be creative as well. It's trying to bring it all into one vehicle is the next challenge.
I think that's really great. And if we could go back just a little bit too, I did not wind up asking you this yet, I don't think. How did you get into fly fishing? Because I feel like it's one of those things that, like, I picture a wise grandfather, gifting forward or something like that. When my brother got into it, no one else in our family was doing any fishing, and I mean, it was a great experience for him to get to know like a whole community of people. But I feel like someone else had to show him like, yeah, this is actually interesting.
So mine was the exact opposite. No one in my family fishes, like zero, absolutely no one. I grew up near the River Severn. So I remember we used to ride our bikes down there and sometimes swim. One day we'd ridden our bikes down and I'd gone up to the river where we normally jump off this rock and go in. There was a huge, I didn't know what it was at the time, but it was a pike, which is like a predatory freshwater fish. It just sort of looked at me and rolled and then disappeared. It just set something off that like there's monsters in there, and like it was so exciting. And then there was sort of, you'd see these old boys fishing and I'd ask a question and they had all these like specialist tools like line nippers and knot tires and keepers, and just that sort of hyperfixation on something. It just locked in that there's all these little problems that they'd already solved. I was really interested, so I sort of into freshwater fishing, but there was too much stuff, and I was just trying to refine it until like I sort of find the essence. And fly fishing for me is the simplest form. It's like the ultimate trick. Like there's no bait. It's just the weight is in the line, so there's some elegance in the casting, and it's quite meditative. I find it. I don't meditate, but in any other form. But when I'm fishing, I find myself really zen. You're sort of chasing a feeling almost, rather than a result, which is quite rewarding. And then the rods and the reels, that mechanically they're quite beautiful, and the sounds, and it all sort of came together for me in something that was really essential. It put me out in nature, gave me a place to sort of focus and sort of find calm, and it sort of introduced me to all these niches, I suppose. There was a Graham Davis, who I mentioned earlier, who was the person who sort of helped me get my first sort of passive income through a royalty. The story of why he took me on to do that was he was working at PDD at the time, and he was working with another engineer. They were trying to make this. It was a medical device, and it needed to have an O-ring assembled onto it. It had two engineers and a freelancer working on this problem. I remember walking past the first day and seeing it, and sort of asking like, "Oh, what are you trying to do?" And they'd said, "Oh, we're trying to get this tiny O-ring around this thing, and it's really challenging for X, Y, and Z." And I knew that from fishing, you could buy a tool that did that. There was a whole fascination, like this whole trend, people fishing with really small fish pellets, so little cylindrical pellets, which they'd attach to the hook with an O-ring. It was the exact same challenge. These competition fishermen were able to do like 10 a second. Like it was really quick. And I just said, "Oh, you should just buy this fishing thing." They'd sort of dismissed it as this crazy idea. Then like a week later I asked them again, and they still hadn't managed to do it. So I just brought this fishing thing in with me and just gave it to them. Graham saw it, and it was just like this ability to sort of transfer ideas and be able to understand it sufficiently in one category to understand how it could move over. I think there's some magic in fishing for that for me. Actually, it's like this huge repository of niche problems, and actually being able to pull from them and apply it to my day job has been relatively successful over the years. I've taken a lot from it.
That's awesome. I love that. That's such a clear example of knowledge transference from like one discipline to another. I think that's brilliant. And I really appreciate you telling us about that, Josh.
No, it's a pleasure.
The Founders Voyage community is based on disciplined entrepreneurship, which is like a framework for starting companies and things like that. And one of the key things is about sort of having ideas and then killing them quickly, right? So one thing that I do like to hear from, and you've been incredibly honest with us, and I really, really appreciate that. Were there ever any major pivots or deviations from your plan that you had to go through when you realized something wasn't working? And looking back, would you change anything about how you went about it?
Yeah. So there's a company I've not talked about yet, which was a well, it was a startup I looked at doing with a friend called Lead Reckoning. It started off as we I had a friend who was into clay pigeon shooting. He'd talk about it, and I just became aware that the shell casings were always wasted, and I was just getting into this idea of like, could design and sustainability be? And it's that first route of, oh, just recycling, which is, I think, is the lowest order, but at the time it was where like the most, it was the important one. Like, what if you could take the brass from a shotgun shell, use it to make a product? So I got into that, but actually the shells is plated steel, not brass, and there's a lot of lead contamination. And if you weigh out the mass of the shotgun shell, the valuable piece is like a HDPE plug, like a plastic plug. And so again, it's challenging to sell. When you run the numbers, there's this much plastic and this much steel. The big volume of the shotgun shell was the lead. People are shooting like 28 grams of lead every shot. They might shoot 50 shots in a session. That's 1.5 kilograms of lead per person. They might be doing it the same discipline, the same 50 shots, the same standing point in the same field. For some of these clubs were running for 50, 100 years. All the lead was falling in the same place, and tonnage weight of scrap lead is like, it was floating from about £700 a ton to £1,200 a ton, and actually it became this whole, if we could get that lead back, we'd be doing an environmental service, we'd be doing a land cleanup, also be having this resource that we could sell or repurpose. And we ended up going out and doing loads of sampling. We spent like, this was one of my longest breaks from work. I was like 5 months, but going around all the ranges in the UK and digging up samples from various field locations and mapping out where the lead would land. And some of the places, 20% of the mass of the earth was lead. We're getting really excited about, when you run the numbers, that this could have been millions of pounds of revenue and like this much environmental cleanup. And we had this vision that we'd do 3 years, and from that we'd have enough seed money to start this sort of environmental consultancy. The bit we had to pivot on was realizing that after 5 months, didn't really want to be a foreman on a site digging up lead. And that was, I think, yeah, that was into, I didn't kill that idea quick enough, but that was a really hard one to kill. It was realizing that actually it could be successful, but maybe it's not the success that I want to find. I think that's been the hardest idea to drop so far to date.
Excellently asked question, Spencer, and that was such a great answer. I really appreciate that. I don't know, for some reason the image of the clay pigeons is like one that takes me back to like the Nintendo Duck Hunter days, and I don't know, I had a good visual to go along with that. So, but thank you so much for sharing that. I think if it's all right, we've got one final question for you. And so we're not holding your feet to the fire on this at all. We kind of end with this. What words of wisdom do you want to leave us with today? So this could be a favorite quote. It could be some advice someone else gave you, or it could just be, any lesson or takeaway from your journey so far.
From my experience, it's been, so Ripplebox is small. Like it's I think there's opportunity for it to do something, but it's never going to be this huge thing. Actually, it's taken so much time and passion and energy to get there. I think there's I suppose my handover, my big learning from trying to be an entrepreneur is make sure that it's an idea that's enough to fit your aspirations. I suppose it's going to take the same amount of work to ask someone for 50 grand as it is 500. Like it's make sure you're starting a project that can go as big as you want it to be. Otherwise, you can start to feel trapped by it, I think. Yeah, we're big. It would be. It's my advice.
Thank you, Josh. I think you've given us 2 excellent quotes. We always like to, for the podcast, we like to start with a quote from the speaker, and it's going to be hard to fight between the one you just gave us and your one earlier of, I wrote it down. It could be successful, but not the kind of success I wanted to find. And I think that's brilliant. And I think that's something that a lot of people would get too far down the road to realize that. And I think there's a million stories of that happening.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Josh, thank you so much for coming on today. I really, really enjoyed talking with you. And thank you for everything you've shared with us and everything you've taught us today.
Pleasure. Thank you for making the time.
Absolutely. Now, Nancy and I and the team behind Founders Voyage feel fortunate to be part of this community with you and everyone here, and for the opportunity to bring this cooperative learning experience to you each week. This includes you, Josh, but if anyone has any nominations they want to give for future Saturday sessions, please let us know. We're always looking for people who can bring value to and get value from the community. And thank you again, everyone, for joining, and have an amazing day and evening ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josh, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And there was a side conversation on the questions and discussion channel if you want to scroll back to that later on, between trusting your friends in business. So I always appreciate where these conversations go in both directions. So thanks so much, Josh.
A pleasure.
All right, have a great rest of your weekend. I hope that your kid-free weekend allows you to do some adult things that you haven't done in a while.
We're going to go to the tip. We're finally going to throw out all the plush toys in the cupboards that we've been hiding from her for the last 3 months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's
all right. Well, a weekend of cleaning. That's always a good thing too.
Yeah. Organizing. We're trying to marry Curie ourselves. We're trying to declutter.
Well done. All right. Well, take care. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
You've just finished another episode of Founders Voyage, the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. The team at Founders Voyage wants to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and if so, please share this with someone else who might enjoy this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and by donating to our Patreon. Outro music today is Something for Nothing by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band.